Imagine being a man who survived mustard gas in the trenches of France, who watched your best friends die in the mud of no man's land, who came home broken but breathing, only to be sent to a forgotten strip of land in Florida, and then abandoned there to die in the worst hurricane ever recorded on American soil. That is not a story most Americans know. That is not a story most Americans were ever supposed to know. But it happened. It happened in September of 1935 on a narrow chain of islands dangling off the southern tip of Florida, and the men who died there were not strangers. They were heroes. They were veterans. They were the men who bled for this country in the Great War, and when they needed their country most, their country turned its back on them. Tonight, we are going to change that. Tonight, we are going to speak the names of the forgotten. Tonight, we are going to tell the truth about one of the most devastating storms in American history and the shameful political failure that turned a natural disaster into a mass grave. To understand what happened on Labor Day weekend in 1935, you have to go back much further. You have to go back to 1917, to the muddy, blood-soaked fields of Europe, where a generation of young American men volunteered or were drafted to fight in what was called the war to end all wars. These men were farmers from Kansas and factory workers from Pittsburgh and fishermen from the coast of Maine. They were 18 years old and 22 years old and 25 years old. They crossed the Atlantic on crowded ships, and they marched into a nightmare that no human being should ever have to face. They breathed poison gas. They saw men disintegrate in artillery explosions. They spent months living in trenches filled with rats and disease and death. And when it was over, when the armistice was signed on November 11th, 1918, they came home expecting a hero's welcome. They came home expecting gratitude. They came home expecting that their country would take care of them, because that is what their country had promised. What they got instead was a slow and grinding betrayal that would take 15 years to reach its bloody conclusion. The bonus army. If you know anything about the Great Depression, you may have heard that phrase. In 1924, Congress passed the World War Adjusted Compensation Act, which promised veterans a bonus for their service. But there was a catch. A massive, devastating catch. The bonuses would not be paid until 1945. The veterans were handed a certificate, a piece of paper, a promise that their sacrifice would be rewarded 20 years in the future. For men who were young and healthy in the 1920s, that seemed tolerable. But then the stock market crashed in 1929. Banks failed. Factories closed. Unemployment exploded across the country. Men who had survived the worst war in human history suddenly could not feed their families. They were sleeping in cardboard boxes and standing in bread lines and watching their children go hungry. And all the while, they held those bonus certificates in their hands, those pieces of paper worth thousands of dollars, and the government told them they would have to wait. By 1932, they had waited long enough. In the spring of that year, tens of thousands of veterans began marching toward Washington, D.C. They came from every corner of the country, riding in boxcars, hitchhiking, walking with whatever belongings they could carry. They called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force, or more commonly, the Bonus Army. They set up camps across the Anacostia River from the Capitol building, makeshift cities of tents and shanties, and desperate men. At the peak, estimates suggest that somewhere between 15,000 and 25,000 veterans had descended on Washington, accompanied by their wives and children. They were peaceful. They were organized. They were disciplined. They sang army songs and held parades and sent delegations to meet with members of Congress. They wanted one thing. They wanted their bonus paid now, when they needed it, not in 1945 when many of them might already be dead. Congress briefly considered their plea and then voted it down. Most of the bonus army began to disperse, but thousands remained, refusing to leave, setting up permanent camps and waiting for the government to change its mind. President Herbert Hoover ordered the Army to remove them. General Douglas MacArthur, then Army Chief of Staff, took personal command of the operation. On July 28, 1932, cavalry soldiers on horseback and infantry soldiers with fixed bayonets advanced on the veterans' camps. Tanks rolled through the streets of the nation's capital. Tear gas was deployed against men who had once charged into German machine gun fire. The camps were burned. Veterans were beaten. Women and children fled in terror. 2 veterans were killed. An infant died from tear gas exposure. Several children were injured. And Douglas MacArthur, standing in the ruins of the camps, declared that it had been a communist uprising and that he had saved the Republic. The photographs of that day circled the world. American soldiers attacking American veterans. American tanks rolling against American war heroes. It was a public relations catastrophe for Hoover, and many historians believe it contributed significantly to his landslide loss to Franklin Roosevelt in the election of November 1932. Roosevelt came into office promising a New Deal for the American people. The veterans hoped that meant them too. But Roosevelt was a complicated man with complicated political calculations. The bonus issue was expensive. Paying all the veterans their bonuses immediately would cost the federal government billions of dollars that Roosevelt claimed he could not spare. And so the veterans waited again. And again their patience was tested. And again their government found creative ways to offer them something that was not quite what they had asked for. By 1934 and 1935, the New Deal was creating jobs through a variety of federal programs. One of those programs was the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, which was tasked with employing unemployed men across the country on public works projects. Among the men who found their way into these programs were hundreds of World War I veterans who had been part of the bonus army marches. These men, many of them middle-aged now, many of them struggling with the physical and psychological wounds of the war, were sent to a place far from the political controversy of Washington, D.C. They were sent to the Florida Keys. The Florida Keys in the 1930s were not the tourist paradise they would eventually become. They were isolated. They were remote. They were accessible only by boat or by the Florida East Coast Railway's extension, which Henry Flagler had built at enormous expense decades earlier. The Overseas Highway, the famous road that now connects the Keys to the mainland, did not yet exist. The veterans were being sent to build it, or rather, to build the bridges and roadbeds that would eventually become it. Their camps were located on Lower Matacam Key and other nearby islands, exposed strips of land barely above sea level, surrounded by open water, with no shelter and no escape route if something went wrong. And something was very, very wrong with this arrangement from the beginning. The men lived in tar paper shacks and tents. The heat was brutal, regularly exceeding 100 degrees. Mosquitoes were a constant torment. The work was backbreaking. Many of the veterans were in poor health to begin with, damaged by years of poverty and war trauma, and in some cases by alcohol. The camps were run by FARA, the Federal Relief Agency, and the administration of those camps was, by most historical accounts, disorganized, underfunded, and grossly inadequate for the conditions. Veterans complained about the food, about the medical care, about the conditions of their housing. Some of those complaints made it into newspapers. Some of them reached sympathetic ears in Washington. But for the most part, these were forgotten men, and the machinery of government that had forgotten them once was content to forget them again. The summer of 1935 was particularly brutal in the Keys. The heat was relentless. Tensions in the camps were high. Several veterans had died from heat stroke and other causes during the summer months. The situation was bad enough that some administrators were beginning to raise concerns, but the bureaucratic wheels turned slowly, and the concerns were noted and filed and largely ignored. Meanwhile, far out in the Atlantic Ocean, a weather system was beginning to organize. Meteorology in 1935 was a far cry from what we have today. There were no weather satellites. There were no Doppler radar systems. There were no computer models tracking the development and path of tropical storms with anything approaching modern precision. Weather forecasting depended on ship reports, land-based weather stations, and the expert intuition of meteorologists working with incomplete information. The Weather Bureau, as it was then called, did its best with the tools it had. But those tools were primitive, and the storm that was forming in the Atlantic in late August and early September of 1935 would prove to be something that no tool of that era could fully anticipate. The storm developed slowly at first, drawing energy from the warm waters of the Caribbean and the Bahamas. By September 1st, Labor Day Sunday, it had intensified significantly. Weather Bureau forecasters in Jacksonville began issuing warnings. The storm was moving toward the Florida Keys. It was dangerous, but in 1935, how dangerous a hurricane could be was not yet fully understood. The concept of Category 5 storms, of storms with winds exceeding 150 or even 200 miles per hour, was not part of the public consciousness. Storms were considered severe or not severe. The full, terrifying power of what was approaching the Keys was not communicated clearly to the people on the ground. The men in the veterans' camps received word that a storm was coming sometime on Labor Day, September 2nd. The plan, such as it was, called for a rescue train to be sent down from the mainland to evacuate the veterans before the storm hit. It sounds straightforward. It was anything but. The logistics of evacuating several hundred men from the lower Keys by train required a locomotive and cars to be assembled in Miami, driven south on the Florida East Coast Railway, loaded with the veterans, and driven back north to safety. This should have begun hours earlier. Weather warnings had been circulating for days. The storm's track toward the Keys was becoming clearer, but the decision to actually call for the evacuation train was delayed. There are competing accounts of who was responsible for the delay, who had the authority to make the call, and why it was not made sooner. What is not in dispute is that the train did not leave Miami until late in the afternoon of Labor Day, and by the time it reached the Keys, it was too late. The Labor Day hurricane of 1935 made landfall on Upper Matacam Key at approximately 9 in the evening on September 2nd. Its central pressure dropped to an almost unimaginable level, the lowest ever recorded for a landfalling hurricane in the United States at that time, and among the lowest ever recorded in the Western Hemisphere. Wind speeds reached nearly 200 miles per hour. The storm surge, a wall of ocean water pushed ashore by the ferocious winds, reached heights of 17 to 20 feet on some of the lower islands. On a chain of islands where most of the land was less than 5 feet above sea level, a 20-foot wall of water was not merely catastrophic. It was apocalyptic. The rescue train was hit by the storm surge before it could reach the veterans' camps. The locomotive and most of the cars were derailed. The engine itself was tossed off the tracks. The engineer survived, but the train that was supposed to save the veterans was now itself a casualty of the storm. In the camps on Lower and Upper Matacam Key, men had no warning and no time. The storm hit with terrifying speed. The wall of water came in the darkness, in the howling wind, in conditions that made it impossible to see or hear or run. Men who had survived the Western Front, who had walked through fields of mustard gas, who had lived through the worst humanity could inflict on itself, were swept away by the indifferent fury of nature. Some tried to climb trees. Some tried to hold on to whatever fixed structure they could find. Many simply had no chance at all. The water rose so fast and the wind was so violent that survival was nearly impossible for anyone caught in the open on the lower islands. By morning, when the storm had passed and the sun rose over the devastated Keys, the scale of the horror became clear. The islands looked as though they had been scoured clean. Entire camp structures had been swept away. Bodies were everywhere, tangled in mangroves, hanging from trees, scattered across what had been the campgrounds. Many bodies were never recovered. Some were carried miles by the storm surge and found days or weeks later. Others disappeared into the sea entirely. The official death toll from the Labor Day hurricane of 1935 would eventually be placed at approximately 408 people, though many historians believe the true number was higher, perhaps as high as 600 or more, given the difficulties of accounting for all the transient workers and veterans who were in the Keys at the time. Of those confirmed dead, the largest single group was the World War I veterans in the relief camps. Estimates of veterans killed range from 250 to nearly 300. Men who had survived the war to end all wars were killed in a storm on a strip of land where they should never have been, without adequate shelter, without adequate warning, and without an adequate evacuation plan. The news reached the mainland within hours of the storm's end. The first reporters to reach the Keys described scenes of almost incomprehensible destruction. Ernest Hemingway, who lived in Key West, was among the first writers to reach the scene. He made the drive up through the devastated islands, and what he saw left him shaking with rage. He wrote a piece for the leftist magazine New Masses that is one of the most powerful pieces of anger journalism ever published in America. He described the bodies, the destruction, the twisted wreckage of the rescue train. And he asked, with unrestrained fury, who was responsible for sending these men to die on those islands without adequate preparation and without adequate evacuation? Who sent them there? He demanded. And why? And who would be held accountable? It was a question that resonated across the country. The political fallout was immediate and fierce. Newspapers demanded investigations. Veterans organizations were outraged. Members of Congress called for hearings. The Roosevelt administration, which had been in charge of the FARA program that ran the veterans' camps, was placed on the defensive. FDR himself expressed condolences and ordered an inquiry, but the political reality was that any serious investigation risked exposing the fundamental negligence of the federal response to the veterans' plight, not just in the days before the storm, but in the years of inadequate treatment that had preceded it. The congressional investigation that followed produced a report that was sharply critical of the evacuation response, pointing specifically to the delays in requesting the rescue train and the failure to begin evacuation early enough given the available weather information. But the investigation fell short of what many veterans advocates demanded. No one was criminally charged. No senior official lost their position over the disaster. The bureaucratic responsibility was diffused across so many agencies and officials that accountability became impossible to pin down precisely. What the disaster did accomplish, in a cruel and terrible irony, was to finally break the political logjam over the veterans' bonus. The public sympathy generated by the images and stories of veterans dying in a storm, abandoned on their isolated island worksite, made it politically impossible for Congress to continue delaying payment. In 1936, Congress passed the Adjusted Compensation Payment Act, which provided for immediate payment of the veterans' bonuses. Roosevelt vetoed it. Congress overrode his veto. The veterans finally received their bonus money, more than a decade after it was first promised and nearly a year after hundreds of their brothers had died in the Labor Day hurricane. The bodies of many of the veterans were never properly identified or given individual burials. The sheer scale of the death toll, combined with the condition of the bodies after days in the tropical heat, made individual identification impossible in many cases. A mass cremation was ordered for many of the remains. A memorial was eventually built on Upper Matacam Key, a simple but powerful monument that still stands today, honoring the men who died there. It is one of the few places in America where this particular tragedy is remembered in any formal way. The Labor Day hurricane of 1935 holds a number of grim distinctions in the historical record. It remains to this day the most intense hurricane by central pressure ever to make landfall in the United States. Its winds were among the highest ever recorded in any Atlantic hurricane. The storm surge it produced on the Keys was among the deadliest in American history, and the human death toll, concentrated almost entirely on that narrow chain of islands, made it one of the deadliest natural disasters in American history, though it has never received the same level of historical attention as other great disasters of the era. Part of the reason for that historical obscurity is the political sensitivity of the story. The narrative of World War I veterans being killed by a hurricane while working in a federal relief camp inevitably raises uncomfortable questions about the policies and priorities of the Roosevelt administration, which has generally been treated favorably by American historians. The veterans' advocates of the time accused the administration of criminal negligence. Hemingway used even stronger language. But the political consensus that formed around the New Deal in subsequent decades made it difficult for those criticisms to gain lasting traction in the mainstream historical record. There is also the uncomfortable connection to the broader Bonus Army saga. The same veterans who had marched on Washington in 1932 and been driven out at bayonet point by the Army were, just 3 years later, working in federal relief camps under conditions that their advocates described as little better than indentured servitude. The continuity of that treatment, the sense that the government had found a way to get rid of these inconvenient men by shipping them to a remote corner of Florida, was not an interpretation that the Roosevelt administration was eager to publicize. But the historical record supports a darker reading than the official narrative has generally offered. The veterans who died on Labor Day in 1935 had been placed in harm's way by the decisions of their government. The camps were inadequately equipped for the conditions. The warning signs of approaching danger had been present for days before the storm made landfall. The evacuation response was delayed in ways that cost lives. And in the end, the men who paid the ultimate price were among the most vulnerable members of American society. Men who had already given everything to their country and received very little in return. Let us take a moment to think about who these men were as individuals. They were not statistics. They were not a mass of anonymous suffering. They had names and faces and stories. There was Raymond Sheldon, a veteran from Georgia who had survived the battles of the Meuse-Argonne and who died on Matacam Key trying to help his fellow veterans reach shelter before the storm surge hit. There was George Pepper, who had been gassed in France and who had spent years drifting through the Depression unable to find steady work before ending up in the Keys. There were men from every state, men who spoke with Southern drawls and Northern accents and Midwestern cadences, men who had shared foxholes and rations and misery in the trenches of Europe and who had ended up sharing one final catastrophe on a strip of coral and sand in Florida. Among the survivors were men who spent the rest of their lives haunted by what they had seen. Some testified before Congress about the conditions in the camps and the failures of the evacuation. Some tried to tell their stories to anyone who would listen. But as the years passed and the New Deal mythology solidified and the Second World War arrived to create a new set of heroes and a new set of tragedies, the story of the Labor Day hurricane veterans receded from public consciousness. By the 1950s, most Americans had never heard of it. By the 1970s, it was relegated to specialized histories of Florida and specialized studies of hurricane meteorology. Today, outside of a small community of historians and veterans history enthusiasts, it is almost entirely forgotten. That is a profound injustice. These men deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be acknowledged as victims not only of a natural disaster, but of a systemic failure of the government that owed them better. They deserved the bonus they were promised in 1924. They deserved adequate shelter and medical care in the camps where they were sent. They deserved to be evacuated before the storm arrived. They deserved, at the very minimum, to have their deaths properly investigated and the officials responsible for the failures held to account. None of that happened, not fully, not adequately. But we can do something small. We can remember them. We can tell their story. We can refuse to let the convenient amnesia of official history erase what they experienced and what they suffered. The meteorological legacy of the 1935 hurricane is also significant and worth understanding in detail. The storm formed in the central Bahamas region and underwent what modern meteorologists would recognize as rapid intensification, a process by which a hurricane's winds increase dramatically in a short period of time. In just 24 hours before landfall, the storm went from a severe tropical cyclone to something approaching the theoretical maximum intensity for a hurricane in that region. This rapid intensification was driven by exceptionally warm sea surface temperatures, low wind shear in the upper atmosphere, and a moist, unstable environment that fed the storm's energy like a massive heat engine. When the storm made landfall, its central pressure was measured at approximately 892 millibars, an almost incomprehensible reading that shattered previous records for landfalling Atlantic hurricanes. To put that in perspective, a normal sea-level atmospheric pressure is about 1013 millibars. A pressure reading of 892 means the storm had essentially created a near vacuum at its center, pulling air and water and everything else toward it with incredible force. The winds at the eye wall, the ring of most intense thunderstorms surrounding the calm center of the hurricane, likely exceeded 180 miles per hour and may have reached 200 miles per hour in gusts. The storm surge that accompanied those winds was the true killer. On the flat, low-lying islands of the Keys, there was nowhere for the water to go except inland, and there was no high ground to retreat to. The surge arrived as a nearly vertical wall of water, pushed by hurricane-force winds across open water for hundreds of miles before finally crashing onto land. On Lower Matacam Key, eyewitness accounts described the water rising from nothing to 17 or 18 feet in what seemed like minutes. Men who had taken shelter on the roofs of the low wooden camp buildings were simply washed away when the surge arrived. The rescue train provides one of the most dramatic and tragic individual stories of the disaster. The train had left Miami under the command of a crew that was trying to reach the camps in time. As the storm intensified, the train made its way south along the overseas extension of the Florida East Coast Railway, a remarkable piece of engineering that ran along a series of bridges connecting the islands. When the storm surge hit, it caught the train on a low causeway near Isla Morada. The surge lifted the passenger cars and threw them off the tracks. The locomotive itself, a massive steel machine weighing hundreds of tons, was pushed sideways and nearly overturned. Most of the cars were destroyed. Photographs taken after the storm show the locomotive lying on its side in the water, a massive piece of industrial machinery treated like a toy by the force of the water. The engineer of the locomotive survived, and his account of what happened that night is one of the most vivid primary source documents of the disaster. He described the wall of water appearing out of the darkness, the train being struck and derailed in seconds, the screaming of metal and the roar of wind and water, and then the sudden, eerie silence of the hurricane's eye passing overhead before the back wall of the storm hit with renewed fury. The aftermath of the storm was characterized by the particular horror of tropical decomposition. The bodies of the dead, lying in the heat and humidity of the Florida Keys in early September, deteriorated rapidly. Recovery workers who arrived in the days after the storm faced conditions that were both physically and psychologically overwhelming. The decision to conduct a mass cremation of many of the remains was made partly out of public health necessity and partly because individual identification was simply impossible for many victims. Veterans who had been reduced to anonymous statistics by the failures of the government in life found themselves anonymous in death as well. The memorial that was eventually built on Upper Matacam Key is a simple concrete structure containing the cremated remains of some of the victims. It was dedicated in 1937, 2 years after the disaster. A bronze plaque lists the names of some of the identified dead. The monument stands today along the overseas highway, visible to motorists passing through the Keys, but rarely noticed by those who do not already know to look for it. Tourists drive past it every day on their way to Key West, without knowing that the road they are traveling was built, in part, with the labor of men who died in a catastrophe that their government failed to prevent. The overseas highway itself, which was completed in 1938 using some of the same engineering work that the veterans had been helping to develop before the storm, is another complex legacy of the disaster. The road that the veterans were helping to build, the road that their deaths in some ways helped to publicize and ultimately to fund through the political changes that followed, now carries millions of tourists per year through the Florida Keys. It is a beautiful drive, one of the most scenic in America, a ribbon of road connecting dozens of small islands across clear blue water. And along that road, if you know where to look, you will find the small memorial that marks the place where hundreds of men who survived a world war were killed by a storm their government failed to prepare them for. The broader historical context of the 1935 hurricane disaster includes the ongoing debate about the treatment of veterans in American society that has never really been resolved. The pattern that produced the bonus army marches and the Labor Day hurricane deaths has repeated itself in various forms throughout American history. Veterans of the Korean War struggled for recognition and benefits. Vietnam veterans returned to a divided and sometimes hostile country. Veterans of the Gulf War and the Iraq and Afghanistan wars have faced persistent struggles with the VA system, with inadequate mental health care, with homelessness and unemployment, and the invisible wounds of combat. The specific details change from era to era, but the underlying pattern of a country that valorizes its veterans in the abstract while failing them in the specific has remained remarkably consistent. The World War I veterans who died in the Keys were part of the first generation to experience this pattern on a large and visible scale. They had done what their country asked of them. They had crossed an ocean and fought a war of unimaginable brutality. They had come home expecting care and respect and the modest financial compensation their government had promised. Instead, they got a bonus certificate redeemable in 20 years, a president who sent soldiers against them in the streets of Washington, and eventually a worksite on a hurricane-exposed barrier island with inadequate shelter and no reliable evacuation plan. The political reckoning that followed the disaster, limited as it was, produced one lasting change. The immediate payment of the veterans' bonus, which Congress passed over Roosevelt's veto in January 1936, was a direct political consequence of the outrage generated by the Labor Day deaths. It was a delayed and partial justice, and it came too late for the men who died on Matacam Key, but it was something. The men who survived the storm and lived to see the bonus finally paid understood the bitter irony of it. Their dead brothers had, in some sense, bought with their lives the financial relief that the living had been denied for a decade. There is one more dimension of this story that deserves attention, and that is the question of memory and memorialization. The United States has built extensive and impressive memorials to its war dead. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial on the National Mall is one of the most visited and emotionally powerful monuments in the country. The World War II Memorial is a grand tribute to the generation that fought in that conflict. Even the Korean War Veterans Memorial, for a conflict sometimes called the Forgotten War, stands prominently in Washington as a reminder of sacrifice. But there is no national memorial to the World War I veterans who died on Labor Day in 1935. There is no monument in Washington. There is no annual commemoration at the national level. There is only the small concrete structure on Upper Matacam Key in a state park, easily missed by drivers on the overseas highway. That absence is telling. It reflects the political complexity of a story that cannot be told without also telling the story of governmental failure. It reflects the way that inconvenient history tends to be minimized and eventually forgotten when it conflicts with preferred narratives. And it reflects the particular invisibility of veterans who were poor and middle-aged and politically inconvenient in 1935, men who did not fit the heroic warrior image that American culture preferred to attach to its veterans. We are telling their story tonight because it deserves to be told, because the men who died on those islands were not anonymous, because the failures that led to their deaths were not inevitable, because the political and bureaucratic decisions that put them in that position and failed to get them out in time were made by real people with real responsibilities, and those people were never adequately held to account. The Labor Day hurricane of 1935 is a story about the power of nature. Yes, it is a story about the most intense landfalling hurricane in American history. It is a story about meteorology and storm physics and the terrifying energy that tropical cyclones can unleash. But it is also a story about the relationship between a government and the people who served it. It is a story about promises made and promises broken. It is a story about what happens when the men who were supposed to be protected and honored and cared for become inconvenient, and when the machinery of government treats inconvenience as a sufficient reason to look the other way. As we close tonight, let the final image in your mind be not of the storm, not of the wall of water and the howling wind and the overturned train. Let the final image be of the men themselves. Young men crossing the Atlantic in 1917 to fight a war they had been told would make the world safe for democracy. Older men, weathered by poverty and disappointment, riding south into the Florida Keys in 1935, still willing to work, still willing to contribute, still holding on to whatever remained of their faith that the country they had served would eventually do right by them. Those men deserve better. They deserve the country they thought they were fighting for. And remembering them, refusing to let their story be forgotten, is the least and the most important thing we can do for them now.